We're good? All right. Morning, everyone. I'd like to call the meeting of the Audit Committee to order, please. Michelle, are there any public speakers?
No, Madam Chair. Before we get started, we would like to play our automated safety announcement.
Your safety is of foremost importance to the MTA. Therefore, we ask that you listen to the following instructions. In the event of an emergency, notify emergency personnel in the room and 911 should be called. If an alarm sounds, wait for a public address announcement and follow instructions. If told to go to another floor or to evacuate the building, leave all unessential items behind and use stairwell A just across the main hallway or stairwell D down the hallway past the elevators. An automated external defibrillator, AED, for use by trained personnel is in the main hallway just past the elevators. Thank you and have a safe day.
We're good? Thank you. Okay, Michelle, can you take us through the work plan?
Yes, Madam Chair. There are 3 changes to the work plan. The first is a review of the MTA Inspector General's office. This has been removed from the work plan this month. The work in this review is performed by Deloitte in November and then presented in the following period. The last review was presented by Deloitte in January of this year, and so the next review will be presented in January next year.
Great.
The second is the ERM Update Ethics and Compliance Program. This presentation will be postponed until January. And the third, the security of sensitive data and safety systems will be postponed until we can provide a fuller report. This is the final audit committee on the work plan for 2019. The 2020 work plan is included in the committee materials, and any proposed changes will be presented for approval in the January meeting.
Great. Okay. And you know what? I'm going a little bit out of order, but Michelle, welcome. This is your first meeting as the. You came in as Mike retired. Well, this is my second meeting, so Mike retired at my first, and I got Michelle at my second. So I'm doing good. I'm doing good. Great. So thank you. Any questions to the work plan? Okay. If not, we're going to move on. I think we have Chris Hagen from Deloitte is here to present the results of the review of the MTA consolidated financial statements for the first and second quarters of 2019.
Yes. So my name is Chris Hickman. I'm the Audit Managing Director here on the MTA account. This is Patricia Zarita. She is an Audit Senior Manager on the account. Together, Patricia and I led the quarterly review process for the MTA's Q1 and Q2 consolidated financial statements. A quarterly review is substantially less in scope than an audit, and it primarily consists of analytical procedures that we apply to financial data and inquiries of management on any unusual fluctuations that we might see during that process. The purpose of a quarterly review is to ensure that there are no material adjustments that need to be made to the financial statements in order for them to be in accordance with GAAP, and to evaluate the sufficiency and the appropriateness of the footnote disclosures. We have completed our quarterly review procedures, and we are prepared to issue a clean independent auditor's report on the quarterly financial statements. There was one unrecorded misstatement that was communicated to us by management that resulted in the understatement of pension liabilities and the overstatement of net assets in the amount of about $161 million. This pertained to a multi-employer benefit plan called NICERS, for which some of the MTA employees belong to. The information that was required to be provided to NICERS by MTA management was correct, but NICERS management provided the incorrect information to their actuaries. That resulted in errors in the calculation that unfortunately found its way into the MTA's financial statements. We've evaluated and concluded that that error is not material to the consolidated financial statements for the MTA, nor is it material to the individual agencies that it pertains to. Okay? From an internal audit or internal control perspective, there currently isn't a process whereby MTA management gets back from NICERS the underlying calculations for this plan, and we've put forth a recommendation that they get this information so that somebody can evaluate it and conclude on it that it's appropriate prior to it getting recorded in the financial statements. Okay, so I'll pause there for any questions that the audit committee might have on our quarterly review procedures.
Does this variance have any impact on the expense or budget going forward?
It was reflected in the July plan. It did increase our, obligations and our cost under the financial plans, but it's been reflected now in the July plan.
Okay.
And I should say again, the calculation after it was adjusted was correct. So we're not paying more than we should. And the city decided to, or the city pension decided to stretch the recovery of that over time. So we're not getting hit immediately with one adjustment. So again, unfortunate, but it is the correct number, and it's being applied in a way that makes it more manageable for us. So we appreciate that.
Can I just ask so it led to an additional annual contribution to NICERS required from the MTA?
It is increasing what we do, what we are required to contribute.
Yes, annually.
Yeah, that's it.
And you know about the difference?
I'm trying to remember. Was it 100? It's a total 161. So it would be 40 over 40, probably 40 over 4 years.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? If not, we're going to move on. Now for the appointment of the external auditors. As part of this reappointment process, the committee requires the auditor to present to the committee the results of the most recent inspection of Deloitte that was conducted by the PCAOB, or the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. We have a copy of the 2017 report that was issued December 2018. And Chris, will you briefly explain the contents of the report?
Yes, so the process that happens with the PCAOB is because we are registered with them and we do audits of publicly traded companies, they are required under the Sarbanes-Oxley rule to make a selection of our public company audit work papers, and they come in and they will review our work papers and determine whether or not, one, we're following the appropriate auditing standards. They also look to make sure that we're following the appropriate gap, if you will, for our clients, as well as our own firm policies. So while there were some Part 1 findings, there actually has never been in the history of the PCAOB's existence a situation where there's been a firm that had 0 Part 1 findings. Certainly not what I would call the Global 8, if you will. Maybe a smaller firm that might have 2 public companies, they might get lucky, but not in the ones that really practice in that space. We actually have the lowest of all of the big fours. We have the lowest Part 1 findings that's been over the last 4 to 5 years. So our quality has been improving. We are forever vigilant to look for ways to improve our audit quality. We listen to what the PCAOB is finding and the questions that they ask us during their process, and we learn from that process, and we incorporate that into our templates and our audit process and our trainings to our people.
Great. Okay. Bob?
I assume we being the MTA, were not one of the companies that were part of this audit.
That's correct.
And tell me a little about what Part 1 findings are. I assume this is an initial reading, this looks a little scary. So I just want to know why it should not be scary.
Yeah, it can be a variety of things, Robert. It could be a situation where we weren't following our policies correctly, so maybe there's a required consultation on a particular topic that we didn't, a team, excuse me, did not do. That could result in a Part 1 finding. It could also be something where we run a sample design on one of our substantive procedures, and maybe we should have done 5 selections, but for whatever the case may be, 3 were only done. And so they would say, well, you didn't do enough work. And so those things do occur. It's rare. But those things, that's usually what the genesis of what a Part 1 finding. It usually means that there wasn't a sufficient amount of work done, or you didn't follow your own policies.
Well, I gather you're comfortable with
Yes.
these findings.
I mean, this is a peer review that's done. I think it's the appropriate thing to be done. It's been established. I was a CPA in a former career, and large organizations do a lot of work, and you sometimes miss your own internal policies. But if there was something severe that they thought was going to affect the overall quality of the work, it would not be represented as it was here. This would be something major. So these are just small things that occur. But again, the fact that somebody is reviewing it is important. And you got to understand that, these are competitors who are reviewing your work, so nobody's going to get a free ride on anything. So,
Right.
so I am
will
comfortable.
say, having been an auditor, pre-PCAOB and post-PCAOB, audit quality for everyone, I think, has improved as a result of their existence.
That's actually reassuring. Okay, so continuing with Deloitte, Chris, will you tell us about the audit approach for 2019 year-end audits of the MTA financial statements and its agencies? And now Chris will also discuss any new or proposed changes in accounting principles, regulations, or financial reporting practices and its impacts to our financial statements.
Okay, so from that perspective, we actually provided you our client service plan for the year.
Okay.
So I presume that since it was a pre-read that you had the opportunity to read it, so I'll open it up to questions in a bit. But there are a couple things that I want to bring to the audit committee's attention. The first one is on page 6, which is a page with respect to our significant risk due to fraud. Our significant risk due to fraud, which is consistent with last year, is management override. And this is really a professional standard brought down by the PCA, or the AICPA rather. It was actually a Sarbanes-Oxley type of a situation. But so it's not a situation where we have historically had fraud at the MTA or anything like that, but it is a presumed risk of fraud from an industry perspective. And the reason for that is, if you think about it, management, being their architect of their own internal control environment, has a unique opportunity to potentially circumvent those controls, right? So from an audit response perspective, what we do as auditors is we will evaluate the design and implementation of the internal controls around the manual journal entry process, as well as financial reporting and close process. And then from a substantive testing perspective, we will get a download of all the journal entries at all of the agencies, as well as at HQ, and we put it into an audit tool that we have called Optics. And what Optics allows us to do is it allows us to interrogate all of the journal entries that the agencies have made, and search for what we call characteristics of audit interest. And from that, we can then evaluate a much smaller body of journal entries that may have some issues associated with them. Characteristics of audit interest would include things like journal entries that always have round dollar amounts to them, journal entries that are made on a Saturday night at 2 a.m., Christmas Day, journal entries with weird descriptions with terminology like fraud or hide, those types of things, right? And so we will take that smaller body of entries that have those characteristics, and then we'll evaluate each and every one of those, and then we'll make a selection of those journal entries, and we'll sit down with management, get a deeper understanding of that entry, look at the supporting documentation behind it, and make sure it's an appropriate journal entry. From a management estimate perspective, we will look at all the MTA's estimates that we have in scope for our audit, and we're going to look for what we call management bias. So if you think about the financial statements, if management wished to have a certain outcome in the financial statements, they could tweak each one of their estimates to be a little bit more aggressive or a little bit more conservative if they're trying to cookie jar something. And so we'll look at all the estimates and we take a step back and conclude whether or not, from a management bias perspective, if we're seeing any trending that way. And we have not seen that in the past, but that is something we vigilantly do each year.
Great.
Okay? And then I guess from a timing perspective in the audit client service plan, which is on page 7, we've started our audit planning for the current year. We're going to start our interim testing procedures here in October. That'll go through December. And then in January, we'll start on our final audit procedures, which will take us through April.
Okay.
And we'll be ready to issue our
Final
independent auditor opinions at that time, at the end
Great.
of April.
Perfect.
Okay? Any
Thank you.
questions?
David? Rob? If not, thank you. Okay.
Okay.
We're going to move on?
Okay.
So Michelle, your first act as the acting Auditor General. Can you brief us on the status of the work completed by the audit services through the first half of the year, please?
Thank you, Madam Chair. During the first 8 months, we've completed 91 assurance projects with 288 recommendations. In addition, we've completed 183 contract audits. Management has agreed with our findings, and they're taking corrective action to implement the recommendations. To address a concern raised by Commissioner Law in the special board meeting in August, and in line with the recommendations from Alex Partners, we are taking steps to improve the recommendation follow-up process for both internal and external audit reports through the implementation of RSA Archer's GRC system. With respect to the impact of our audits, in addition to affecting positive change, within the assurance audits, we've identified $21.4 million in cost savings and cost avoidance opportunities, and $26.9 million during our review of the capital contracts. We haven't planned, or we plan to have completed by the end of the year 90% of the audits on the plan. Our current staff is 60 out of 83 budgeted positions. We are going to continue to work with human resources to fill the vacancies in line with the hiring freeze as we identify the needs for the 2020 audit plan. This next slide is a snapshot of the business functions, which identifies some of the 145 audits that were on the 2019 audit plan. We continue to cover operational areas within the agencies such as track, signal, and car equipment inspection and maintenance programs, as well as bus depots, bridges, and tunnel operations. In addition, we review administrative areas such as payroll, human resources, procurement, accounts payable. Some of the key audits on our 2019 audit plan include timekeeping and overtime audits across the agencies, medical eligibility, fare evasion at New York City Transit, Long Island Railroad, and Metro North, operating contract audits such as Transit Wireless, cybersecurity, on-time performance, and positive train control. In 2019 to date, some of the highlights of the audits that have been well received by management include overtime audits at New York City Transit and Metro North. Our objective was to ensure that the overtime was being assigned in accordance with the agency directives and controls were in place to limit excessive overtime. Management was very receptive to our findings and agreed to address the control weaknesses identified during our reviews, and we will follow up to ensure that they were effective. In the prescription drug plan, we worked with the BSC and New York City Transit Benefits to identify Medicare-eligible retirees in the commercial prescription drug plan who should be contacted for EGWIP enrollment. We estimated that enrolling members who had not opted out of the program would achieve between $3.9 and $7 million based on the level of enrollment. We also continue to review as-needed contracts in accordance with the recommendations made by the MTA IG. One of those such audits that we did this year identified potential reductions of $1.4 million associated with one of those contracts. The third-party contract audits we do, we continue to review overhead rates in term audits, but we also do some special reviews. We reviewed $46.3 million in costs that Kawasaki Rail Car submitted in support of their New York State contact provision and its $1.83 billion M9 rail car contract with Long Island Railroad and Metro North. We determined that $17.1 million of the submitted costs did not qualify as New York State contract. The reduction was due mainly to work that was priced using the 2014 production cost data. Long Island Railroad agreed to take corrective action, and we will follow up on this issue. In addition, as part of the contract to produce, delivered the 535 R211 subway cars to New York City Transit, the contractor has contractually committed to providing 470 USA jobs relative to the base award. We're actually performing that review now to ensure compliance with that contract term. In addition to our internal audits, both of assurance and contract, we perform two support functions. We have a group that does a quality assurance process for the pension group, where we validate the calculations that are made for the defined benefit and the Long Island Railroad closed plan. We also have an onboard program where we support both railroads in determining fare not collected and improper fare collection rates. And so those are two support functions we perform. A key commitment we made to the FTA was to provide independent oversight of the Sandy projects. With the approval of the Audit Committee, we established the Sandy Oversight Committee in conjunction with the MTA OIG to monitor those efforts. Of the $2.33 billion in grants awarded, we have audited $495 million to date. We have completed 120 projects in this area and made 320 recommendations. Our typical follow-up process, we select a sample of audit recommendations to follow up on to ensure the implementation by management. Our agreement with the FTA requires us to validate 100% of the recommendations made. So we get supporting documentation from the agencies and do testing in those areas. So that's unique for the Sandy audits. We share our audit results with the FTA through a quarterly review process and a quarterly report that they have provided the format to us, and we participate in the quarterly FTA meetings at New York City Transit and Metro North with the FTA. Looking ahead, we are in the process of reviewing the remaining audits on the plan to identify and prioritize those 8 areas with the greatest risk. We have met with the agency presidents, except for Long Island Railroad, which is scheduled for next week, to discuss the audits that are on the remaining plan and ensure that we're identifying the highest risk areas and working in coordination with the agencies to complete the plan. We have already begun the audit planning process for next year. We're realigning our functional areas to coincide with the transformation plan that is in progress at the MTA. Going forward, we will continue to partner with the external audit organizations and track the implementation status of their recommendations as well as our own. As I mentioned, as part of our improved audit recommendation process, the agencies will be reporting the status of the implementation directly into the GRC2 system, and they will be required to upload documentation to support the implementation. We plan to risk rank those recommendations and assure appropriate testing is done through both the internal control and the follow-up audit process to validate that the implementation of the recommendations is complete and has achieved the desired outcome. That concludes.
Thank you, Michelle, very much. Any questions, Michelle? Yes, Bob?
Let me ask two questions.
Yes.
First, I think you mentioned that you have 60 filled positions out of potentially 83.
83, right.
So 23 empty lines at this point. Let me just ask, because in my experience with the city, with many years in two mayoral administrations, when we had hiring freezes, we generally had exceptions for those employees who could bring in revenues greater than the cost. For instance, in finance, tax auditors were generally an exception from a hiring freeze. Is the same thing not true here?
It is true here. We can go to the committee and request that we fill the positions. As part of our determination for what's going to be on the 2020 audit plan, we will be making that decision of what the right number of people are based on the risk of the audits that are left on the plan.
And I should say, we're having ongoing discussions because with the consolidation of many of these functions from the agencies to headquarters, we have fewer locations and fewer processes that may need to be reviewed. That doesn't mean that we couldn't expand the work that the Auditor General's office does with the same number of people, but that's one of the things that we're considering right now, that again, if we're taking all of these functions that are currently in the different silos, agencies, and bringing them together, accounting functions, finance functions, it may be that we don't need the same manpower to do the work that we're currently doing. But again, it leaves open, do we want to utilize the same resources to do more?
Exactly. So as part of the audit review process for next year, we had over 600 auditable units on our audit plan that we tried to cover over a 5-year period. We've been looking at that and realigning it in accordance with this transformation. We've brought it down to about 400, so there are definitely going to be less auditable units. Certain audits we do break up into, it's based at the agency or even within the department. So for example, overtime. If I tried to do just one overtime audit across all the agencies, I would do it forever and I would never be able to issue anything. So that particularly we focus in on a specific agency and a specific department within the agency because the controls are very different from group to group. So that would still be audits that are broken up. However, like accounts payable, we used to have to do accounts payable audits at each of the agencies. With the implementation of the BSC, we have one auditor now that can do the accounts payable audits through the BSC. So there's definitely going to be some consolidation, and I've talked to Bob about it already, and he's agreed that once we determine what that plan need is for next year, they'll ensure that we have the staffing available to do those audits.
So you actually moved into the second question I had,
Okay.
which was on overtime.
Sure.
And since so many people are talking so much about overtime and what exactly is your function in terms of what have you been looking at in 19?
So we did a review of the financial statements when Neil had asked us to do that when he was chair of the audit committee last year. And one of the things we noted was that if we were going to achieve, to be able to make the plan in accordance with what Bob had presented, we needed to hold to our payrolls. And we weren't going to be able to offset that with overtime costs. So I put overtime audits on the plan at every one of the agencies. And what we do is a lot of our information is paper-based. So even as we move to an automated timekeeping system, some of the justifications and the reason codes and the kind of information you really need to determine whether you're doing overtime for the right reasons is on paper. And so what we'll do is we'll actually go in and get those documents, do a review, and see if the actual work that's being performed is in accordance with what senior management has presented. So for example, at New York City Transit subways, Sally has issued a moratorium that explains to the departments exactly what is acceptable for overtime, weather emergencies, subway action plan items, things that ensure a state of good repair. And so we'll get the actual source documents for each indication of overtime and look to see what work was performed, and then talk to management about how they can control to make sure that those costs are in line with what they're instructed. Yes.
As a follow-up, this is a sampling or is it every document?
So the in-depth reviews we do in the divisions, we took 2 months and we did every document within that control area.
Is there a specific report that we will see or have seen on overtime?
So MTA internal audit, we don't issue public documents. We do issue a report to the audit committee. So the members of the audit committee and the board can receive the reports. They have summaries of each of the audits that we've done. So the summary of the transit audit would be within that document. We could provide more details.
So if I am a guest but not a committee member,
You could
I see
request it. We'd be happy to
I'd
get
be-
you that
I'd like
information.
to see it.
We also did, just on the same topic, but another twist, at Metro North, we did an overtime audit and found, we were looking at the excessive hour issue, and they didn't have any reports, so you really, there was no way to determine for those employees that aren't covered by hours of service, there was no way to determine the consecutive hours that were used. So we worked with management and we were able to get that information for a period of time again, and they were able to establish some additional controls. So I think they've been good audits. Management's very receptive to what we have to say, and we're working together with them to improve the controls in the areas where we find weaknesses.
Other questions? Okay, we move on. Thank you, Michelle. Next, we have Michael Garner. Michael, why don't you join us? Michael, as everyone knows, is the Chief Diversity Officer, and he's here to give the committee an update on the Department of Diversity and Civil Rights performance with respects to contract closeouts, site visits, and monitoring procedures. Welcome, Michael. Good morning.
Thank you, and good morning. Ray Burke is going to give you an overview of the closeouts, site visits.
Morning.
Morning.
The overview for the inactive contracts as of June 30th, 2019. The total contracts reviews and closed were 1,090. Contracts administratively closed were 305, totaling 1,395. The closeouts in progress were 42. Contracts pending agency action was 32, for a grand total of 1,469.
Let me share some commentary with that also as well.
Please.
So when projects are closed out by the respective operating agencies, they send us a notice of final payment. But in working with internal auditor Michelle and her staff, we finally figured out that a lot of agencies, although that they submit that to us and we close out our projects, they're lingered because the official thing is to close out the contracts in PeopleSoft. And a lot of times that's not happening in a timely manner. So we've been engaging the MTA operating agency presidents and focusing on ensuring that they are closing out their projects as well. And so Michelle has been advising us as to how to get that done more effectively. So we're starting to see some traction. Right.
Great.
Next slide.
Thank you.
Okay, the next slide shows the breakdown of the closeouts through the various quarters. The total for the second quarter of 2019 is 1,395. As Mike mentioned, at that particular time of those numbers, there were 42 contracts that were still requiring closeout in PeopleSoft. The next slide represents the site visits that were performed by quarter. The totals at this particular time was 185 at the second quarter of 2019. Our current monthly average exceeds 50 per month.
Let me also share some commentary on site visits. Working in conjunction with other agencies, my staff has a requirement to go out and conduct 8 site visits per month. And site visits gives us an opportunity to observe to see if the MWBEs are working in their certification areas. Also to work in conjunction with the IG's office to root out MWBE fraud. Now I have a staff person, Chris has a law enforcement and IG background. And so once we find something at one of our sites, we will then refer to the IG's office for follow-up.
Got it. Thank you.
Next slide. The next slide shows the goal attainment for one of our biggest contracts, which is the Long Island Railroad Third Track project. The project consists of 2 contracts. The first contract is the third track contractor, which is the main design build contract. It's now valued at $1.4 billion. Start date was January 26, 2018. The end date is to be determined. The goals assigned to it were 15% MBE, 15% WBE, and 6% SDVOB. The current attainment is 4% MBE, 6% WBE, and 0.0% SDVOB. The percentage of completion is 26% at this particular time. The second project associated with that is the consultant contract, and the total contract value on that is $66 million. Contract started December 22nd, 2017, and the goals are the same, 15, 15, and 6. The attainment at this particular time is 14% M, 18% W, and 2.7% SDVOB, and the percentage of completion is 36%.
Let me also say that this project is an extremely important project for us. In a meeting I had with Chairman Foy, we are in the midst, as you know, of making history this year. So by March 31st of this year, which ends this fiscal year, the MTA will be the only agency in the history of this region and almost in the country to have paid $1 billion to minority women-owned firms in 1 year. This project is going to go a long way in enabling us to achieve the governor's 30% MWB goal this year. So we are all hands-on with this project and other mega projects, including the Croton-Harmon project in Metro North. That's like a $365 million project. So we're intently hands-on, focusing not only assigning the goals, but monitoring the goals to make sure that our third-party contractors and consultants achieve their goals.
That's great. Thank you, Michael. Great. Any questions, anyone? If not, thank you, gentlemen. All right, we'll move on. So on the Audit Committee charter, for the record, the committee has reviewed and assessed the adequacies of the Audit Committee charter. Based on our review, the committee recommends no changes to the charter at this time. Next, I have a 4-page report that covers the activities of the Audit Committee during the 12 months ended July 31st, 2019. A draft of this report was circulated for your review and comments earlier this week. Any questions or suggestions, gentlemen? Okay. If not, I need to go back and take some votes on some of the actions and reports that were taken. So if you bear with me. The first motion we need is to accept the minutes of the June Audit Committee report. Do I have a motion? Thank you, Robert. Do I have a second? David? Okay, so moved. All right, motion passed. Then I have to, Michelle so graciously took us through the work plan. There were some changes, so I need a motion to accept the changes of the work plan. Thank you, David. Second, Rob? Great, moved. Okay. Then Chris from Deloitte took us through the MTA consolidated financial statements, so I need a motion and second to move the first and second quarters 2019 MTA consolidated financial statements. David? Robert? Great, thank you. Okay, then Chris walked us through how we're going to appoint Deloitte as the MTA's external auditor. I need a motion and a second to vote to appoint Deloitte as our external auditor.
So moved. I'd like just to ask them.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm sorry. Do we have a process where we rotate auditors after a certain number of years?
I asked the same question, so Michelle, why don't you walk us through?
So as part of the accounting standards, they recognize that control weakness, and there's a requirement for them to rotate the partner out. And so this year actually will be the first year with the new partner that we'll have. It's going to be Jill.
Yeah, Jill, so Mike has retired, but we do have policies within our firm that you cannot serve for more than 10 years on a privately held company. In the public company world, it's actually 5 years, so under the PCOB standards. So that is one of the ways that we ensure that we keep ourselves professionally objective and keep our professional skepticism high.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you, Robert. I took the vote, right, on the, okay, so I need a second. Okay, motion passed. Thank you, Chris. Now, the last action I have, I think that's it, right? My motion to adjourn. Okay, second. Rob, thank you. Thank you, everyone,
good
for
at
getting
that.
up bright and early and joining us.
Thank you.
Sure.